All right, thank you very much. So I am Mike McDonell. I am an associate professor in the College of Medicine here, and I have had the good fortune of collaborating with investigators at iReach and through this relatively new center grant that we have called NCARE. And I'm excited to share with you three stories today about contingency management and how that might be a tool for us to use in partnership with Native communities to deal with disparities related to alcohol addiction. So I first want to say thank you all for joining. I'm calling in from the snowy homeland of the Spokane tribe of Indians. We're about to get, I think, 4 or 5 inches of snow, and so winter is not letting go of us. So I'm gonna, like I mentioned, next slide, please. I'm gonna do my best to first sort of talk about what contingency management is and define it and sort of talk about the history of contingency management, where it comes from. And anytime that if you're not a substance use researcher like me, anytime you hear me use the word contingency management, you could just insert incentives, motivational incentives, or what other people call it. So we're going to first tell the story of contingency management as a treatment for drug addiction. And then the second story I'm going to tell is a story about contingency management and how we are using it now to treat alcohol use disorders, because that's a relatively new development in the field. And then the last story, which is kind of a cliffhanger, is going to be looking at how contingency management can be utilized in American Indian Alaska Native communities. And I say it's a cliffhanger because we have been doing this work in partnership with a number of Native communities for the last 6 years, maybe 7 years, I guess. And so we're just coming to the end of one of our studies, and we're just analyzing results. So I'll have some little bit of a teaser sort of in terms of the results that we found in that study. And in our other large study, we're still gathering data. We're just about done recruiting participants, and we'll be gathering data. And so I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about our experiences in implementing this intervention in Native communities. And then I'm going to, set the stage for you to please keep your eyes and ears open, because in the next 12 months, we'll be disseminating these results both at conferences, in the communities, and through professional publications. So next slide, please. So contingency management comes out of a field of behavioral psychology. And so if you know about behavioral psychology and the idea that if you give a reward to somebody, that behavior is more likely to increase. So if you have a child and they get an A on an exam, you might take them out to a restaurant, or you might get them something, a toy that they really want, or the coolest new video game. And that in the future, if that is a reward, if that's reinforcing to them, if that increases their motivation, they'll be more likely to get A's in the future. So that's part of where contingency management comes from. The other sort of basic theory behind the intervention is that we're operating from a worldview that people use drugs to feel good and alcohol to feel good. And when you have a life that is challenging and where you don't have access to a lot of other rewards in your life, or other reinforcers, we would say in behavioral psychology, it's very possible that you might turn to drugs and alcohol as to feel good. And in fact, most of us do. Often people will use drugs or alcohol for the first time, and they think they're going to feel good. What happens is that sort of that part of your brain that's in charge of rewards, it sort of gets hijacked by that drug or alcohol. And that eventually, if you go down down the road of what we used to call alcohol dependence, or becoming sort of addicted, is another term we used to use a lot, to alcohol or drugs, that drug becomes the one thing that's reinforcing to you. And so you may lose a lot of those reinforcers. So if I have a drinking problem, it causes I often get really angry when I'm drunk, drinking too much, and get in a fight with my wife, and eventually she's had enough, she leaves me. Well, now that sort of relationship I have with my wife, maybe with my kids, is damaged, and so that reinforcement isn't there. And so often when people come to my office as a clinician, that one thing they have in their life, or very few things that's reinforcing to them, is that drug and the alcohol that they're using. So I hope that makes sense, and we can talk more about that later, but that's sort of the theory we're operating from in contingency management, is that people use drugs to feel good. Next slide, please. So people use drugs to feel good. Well, maybe we could offer them something else. Maybe we could offer them a tangible reward in exchange for not using drugs or alcohol. And so instead of just taking away their drugs and alcohol, we could offer them some other kind of reward instead. And so this is a study, this is an example of a study, and there's been hundreds of studies done like this on nicotine, methamphetamine, cocaine, I think maybe even caffeine. Where they basically what they did in this study is they brought in 10 people who were cocaine users. They brought them into an inpatient hospital. And what they did is they sat down in front of them and they put a line of cocaine. So these researchers got all the approvals to do this, first of all. And they were able to access cocaine. And so what they are able to do is offer a person a line of cocaine in an amount of money. And we have to adjust this a little bit for inflation because this was done in the 90s or late 90s, early 2000s. And what they did was they offered people 5 cents. And so when you offer people 5 cents who are cocaine users, most people are going to take that line of cocaine. When you move to $1, about 60% are still going to take that one line of cocaine. But if you offer people $2 instead of taking that line of cocaine, so they either can pick cocaine or $2, most people will pick $2. So the idea is that for a very low cost, we could offer someone a tangible incentive as low as maybe $2, and they might choose to use that amount of money over drugs and alcohol. So the premise here is that drug users are reasonable people. They make reasonable decisions. If they're offered an opportunity to engage in a behavior that's still rewarding, but encourages them to stop using drugs, they are likely to choose that behavior. And it doesn't have to be for a lot of money. So next slide, please. So contingency management is the idea that, taking all these principles together, that if you reward a person for a behavior, which in this case is abstinence, that behavior is more likely to increase over time. That's the behavioral psychology principle. The other principle is that if a person really feels one of the few reinforcers left in their life is a drug or alcohol, we're going to only take that away, but we're going to replace it with another appropriate reinforcer instead. And so that's the sort of background behind contingency management. So in contingency management, what we do is we offer tangible rewards or reinforcers for when a person demonstrates drug abstinence. And so again, I'm going to use the term drug for this part of the talk because most of the evidence supporting contingency management supports it as a treatment for drugs, so illegal drugs, illicit drugs, and nicotine. So the steps of contingency management are very simple, and I'm going to show you a video in an upcoming slide to demonstrate how simple the procedure is. Basically, you have to be able to monitor that behavior. So the nice thing about drug use is we can give an inexpensive urine test, and that for the most part can detect for at least 2 or 3 days whether or not that person's used that drug. So there's no discussion, there's no argument, there's no, there's really no temptation for that person to mislead you who's receiving the intervention, because you're gonna do a urine test. And that urine test, in most cases it's a urine test, is then going to determine whether or not that person receives a reward when they come in. The other important principle of contingency management is that the longer you're abstinent, the more of a reward you're going to get every time you demonstrate your abstinence. So you might get $5 the first time you come in and you give a urine test that's negative. Let's say we're targeting cocaine. But maybe by the 3rd or 4th week, you've been continuously abstinent. We're going to give you $15 every time you come in. And that has been shown over and over again to really get people bought into their abstinence and really motivated. It's been shown to keep people motivated and keep them going, because just like in real life, the longer you're at a job, hopefully the more you're getting paid. The longer you're making good choices, the more we want to reward you. And so that's another important part of contingency management. The other thing that's important in contingency management is accountability still. So while we don't have a punishment is not built into contingency management, because all of us who have worked in the field of addiction know that punishment is not an effective way to deal with addiction in the long run. But what we do is we remove the reinforcer. So if a person comes in and they submit a urine test and it's positive for cocaine, they aren't able to earn rewards for that appointment or for that time. But what we say is, come back in a couple days. We'll see you again. Come back and try again. So we encourage them to keep trying and to come back and to keep working on their, trying to not use, and then to come back, and and the next time they come back, they can earn reinforcers if they're abstinent. So that's the sort of basic steps of contingency management. What we know about contingency management in hundreds of studies, again, for drugs, for illicit drugs, is that it's the most effective non-psychopharmacological intervention for initiating abstinence. So it's the best way, besides something like buprenorphine to treat opiate addiction or methadone to treat opiate addiction. You take the pharmacological interventions off the table. When we look at psychosocial talk therapies, other psychosocial therapies, contingency management is probably the most powerful way to get someone to stop using drugs or alcohol. Next slide. So contingency management really can be done for any, targeting any substance that you can detect in a person's urine, or even with nicotine, right? We can do saliva tests. We can even do use saliva tests and things like that are relatively low cost. Those things, we want those to be low cost tests because we're going to do them pretty frequently. So for a typical contingency management intervention, we're going to ask people to come in at least once a week for sure, but probably twice a week, so that we can make sure that we're assessing their abstinence accurately across time. So we're going to, so basically though, we can target, and research has really shown that contingency management's an effective intervention for any drug that you can detect in a person's urine for 2 days or more. So methamphetamine, cocaine, I left out amphetamine, but it's also been shown to work for amphetamine, nicotine, cannabis, and then opioids and benzodiazepine, with some caveats with opiates and benzodiazepines. I want to make sure everyone's clear that the most effective treatment for opioids is an opioid replacement therapy or pharmacotherapy. And contingency management can add some additional benefits to that as well. Next slide. So why do we like contingency management, and why might it even fit within the context of a Native community, and sort of different communities, of course, have different values, but sort of why would it fit with maybe Native values, using that term in a very general way? The idea is that we're teaching new behaviors, or we're teaching behaviors that people engaged in before they started using drugs and alcohol. So instead of focusing on punishing a behavior and telling them to stop, we're focusing on teaching the new behavior. And we give those rewards, and people have to sort of figure out for themselves how they can get to that reward, how they can get to abstinence. So that's a really nice thing about it. But we've published some work in our non-Native studies showing this over and over again, that people like contingency management not because of the prizes. They mention the prizes. It's hard not to like. Most people would like an intervention where you're getting rewarded with tangible things, or with money, or with some other benefit. But they really, through that interaction between the person who's giving the prizes or the rewards and the person who's receiving them, a real bond forms. A non-judgmental, sort of very positive bond forms. And you'll see in the video that I'm going to show, you'll see that demonstrated. So we've documented that in some of our qualitative research. It also just is a positive, fun thing to do. And you really see the way that clinicians change when they start implementing it. And you see really how addiction treatment sort of starts to turn a little bit towards a very positive, motivated, not that it's not, and some clinicians are wonderful, and some clinics are really wonderful in the way that they treat addiction in a very positive way. And this just helps facilitate that. Contingency management helps really support that positive atmosphere and communication. It also builds self-esteem and self-confidence and really self-worth, and you can see that in people's faces, and you can see that in their eyes, and you can, and we see that with their data as well. So it really builds that self-confidence, and it also teaches accountability. So it really does hold people accountable, but in a positive way. Next slide, please. So this is a video where we're demonstrating our specific contingency management procedure that we use in most of our studies. It's called the fishbowl. Here we're using a small garbage can from IKEA, but you can use a bag, you can use whatever. And so what we have in this procedure is we have 500 chips inside that box. Half of them say "good job," or in our Native work, it has an encouraging phrase in a language that is common amongst the people in that site or that location. And so half the chips you don't actually get anything. You get a pat on the back and it says "good job." It says congratulations. It says keep going, stay strong. And so half the chips aren't associated with a tangible prize. The other half are associated with a tangible prize, and those and most of those are associated with a $1 prize or a $1 or $2 prize. We call those small chips. They say small on them. And then about another 8% say large, and that's about those chips can be exchanged for a $20 prize. And then 1 out of 500 says jumbo, and those can be exchanged for a $100 prize. So those would be, really, those are sort of in there to really keep people motivated. So every time a person comes in this study, in this example, we're targeting stimulant drug use, so cocaine, methamphetamine, and amphetamines. And so this example participant has earned 5 draws because not only are they abstinent today in their urine tests for cocaine and stimulant drugs, they've been abstinent for 4 weeks. And so they've earned a total of five prize draws at this visit. And so you're going to see the prize draw procedure and sort of how the participant then gets to exchange those tokens for prizes. So this is just a quick example of how that works and how quick this study visit actually is. We can go ahead and roll that footage.
So we're going to start today by having you do a UA.
Okay.
So if you don't mind, we'll just have you take this and stand up and just head out that way.
Okay, I can do that.
Great.
All right.
Great, Paul. Thank you so much. So we are going to check this here. How's your day been?
Pretty good.
Good, good. So now we're looking to see you are clean for cocaine, amphetamines, methamphetamines, THC, and heroin. So it means you've been in the study for 4 weeks. That means you get 5 draws. Sound good?
Yeah, sounds good.
Excellent.
All right.
Okay. Shake our big bucket.
All right.
Okay, first draw. What do you got?
Small.
Good job.
All right.
Nice. Go back in there. What's this?
Small.
Small. Great. Good job. We're going to 2 smalls.
Can we get a different color?
What's this?
Large!
Hey,
Hey!
good job.
Alrighty, that's the ones I like.
Good job. So that's 2 smalls and a large. So we'll stand up here and
Okay.
have you look at our cabinet.
Okay. Alright.
There we go. Sorry, got a closed door.
Oh, hey.
And grab yourself 2 smalls and a large prize.
Okay, small here?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Oh, wow. What a decision. I don't need any more mac and cheese, though. Oh, I'll take 2 kits. Oh, where's these? Oh, no. This, the lips.
Excellent.
I'll take lips. Okay.
And you can get another small too.
So one more small. Is that a whole cup full of goodies?
Oh, they're just 1 each.
Just one. Okay. Oh, well, oops. I'll take the gloves.
Great.
Can use those this time of year. Okay.
And a large?
And a large. Is that this shelf?
Yep, that's that second shelf.
That's that one there. Okay. What is this here? Oh, we'll take this one.
Fantastic.
Okay.
All right, so you can see sort of, it's a video that we shot a few years ago, basically just, again, demonstrating how simple the procedure is. And so that's really how long a visit takes, outside of just getting the urine sample. We can finish a whole visit in 10 minutes. And so people are asked in contingency management to usually come in like I mentioned, 2 times a week for these very short visits where they get rewards. And we really have designed it, the two times a week is sort of designed to be added on to intensive outpatient addiction treatment. It doesn't have to be, but it's really designed to be. So the idea is that a person would come to a group, they would give a urine sample, and then they go to group, we test that urine sample, and then either at the group, during the group, if it's set up that way, or during the break, they would actually then get their prizes, depending on their results. And so, so that's contingency management in terms of just how we do it. There's also, you can do it any way that you'd like to do it. So you could do it with vouchers, where we give people just gift cards in certain amounts, and they don't have to do that prize draw particular way of doing things. We also are working with a group in Africa, and they've designed what looks like it's not a lottery ticket, but it looks like a lottery ticket. And instead of having that prize draw, you can just scratch off one of the sections of the ticket, and that's the prize that the value that you would get. So there's all kinds of different ways to do this. We generally do not give people money because folks are concerned that people are going to take that money and use to buy drugs or alcohol with it. The important thing to remember is that if you're receiving contingency management and you go out and you use the reward to buy or access drugs or alcohol, and you use alcohol or drugs, then your next urine test is going to be positive and you're going to not get prizes and not get a reward. So those are important things to remember. The other thing you saw from our video is how cramped it was. We were operating literally in a tiny little therapy room, almost the size of a closet. So you can really do this intervention in any place. We do the intervention right now in very small offices. We have some wonderful spaces in other places. And so really I want to emphasize is two things. One, that it can be done in a very small space. You don't need a lot of room, and you just need a bathroom. Then the second thing is that it can be done by anybody. You don't need to be a trained clinician. You don't need to be a psychologist. You don't need to be a chemical dependency counselor. It'd be great if you were, but this could be done by a peer support specialist, by a staff member. It doesn't need to be done by a clinician. So that's the story of contingency management. And again, at the end, I'm glad to answer any questions you might have. And if we don't have time today to answer questions over email or on the phone if you'd like to talk later. So what about alcohol? So there's been lots and lots of studies done on contingency management, as I mentioned, as a treatment for illicit drugs or for cigarette smoking. But because we haven't had a biomarker until recently that really allows you to detect alcohol use for 2 or more days, it's been really tough to do contingency management for alcohol use disorders. So you can think about if a person comes in, and so we have breathalyzers, right? We've used breathalyzers in clinical treatment. We use it. They're available. We can get them. They're accurate. So we have a breathalyzer. The person blows it on Monday. They're negative. Well, they get a bunch of prizes. The problem is if they may have partied all weekend. They may have been drinking all weekend, but they're no longer intoxicated. They have a BAC of 0. And so they're getting prizes. So the idea was, and this has been a big push of the alcohol treatment field recently and research field, has been to develop new biomarkers or to at least explore how we could use new biomarkers to be able to study contingency management in a feasible way. So next slide, please. So ethylgluconoride is a metabolite that's created when you ingest alcohol through the liver, and it's created by your liver. And we have probably done 40 or 50,000 of these ETG tests. Some of you may have encountered ETG in your clinical work, probably through either something like, in some forensic application. ETG has been typically used in the United States as a forensic tool to do as a test to identify people in the court system who have been drinking. So what we find is that we use a very low cutoff level for ETG. And when we use that very low cutoff level, much lower than is used by the court system or reference labs, when we use this very low cutoff level of 100 nanograms per milliliter, we can identify 80% of self-reported drinking for 2 days, any drinking, and we can identify 80% of heavy drinking over about a 5-day period. What we also find is there was initial concerns, especially because it was being used in forensic settings, that that ETG is created basically by any kind of alcohol. So if I'm a nurse and I am in a surgery unit, I'm probably using that, or I'm just a nurse in practice, I'm probably using the alcohol sanitizer 20 or 30 times a day. It's possible that that person would come up positive for ETG, despite the fact that they had not ingested, they had not been drinking alcohol. So what we find in our work is that if we just educate participants about that, we've never had a case where we've believed, or the person's reported to us, I didn't drink and I used Purell 20 times a day, or I cooked with vanilla. That just doesn't seem to happen when we educate people. And so that's not been an issue. For those of you who have used that in forensic setting, ETG, you might have heard about that issue. We just don't find that to be an issue. The other exciting breakthrough a couple of years ago was that there's now a point-of-care dip card that has a cutoff that's higher than what we use, but still probably going to detect most drinking for the last couple of days, or at least heavy drinking for the last couple of days. And that's available for purchase. It costs about $4 or $5 depending on your volume. And so there is now a dip card, or a immediate results stick that you can use. You see the picture on the other side of the screen is our urine analyzer. So we have, I think, 8 of these urine analyzers in different Native communities and in some of my other studies located throughout the West. And so we use these analyzers in our research, but now, again, there's these dip cards. So these analyzers are expensive. They allow you to get a specific level of ETG, but really the dip cards now, but they're expensive, and so that makes it much more less feasible to do the intervention. So these new dip cards now allow clinicians and clinical programs to actually do the intervention at a lot lower cost and in a lot more effective way. So now we're basically, our premise and the second story I'm telling you is that ETG is the way, that the tool that we can use to implement a contingency management intervention and see if it works for alcohol. So next slide, please. So these are results of our first study that our group did here at WSU, along with colleagues at University of Washington, looking at whether or not, and using ETG as our biomarker to assess abstinence, and then giving people rewards for abstinence from ETG if this was an effective intervention. And the population that we're working with are community mental health patients. So this is not research from Native communities. These are individuals who have serious mental illness and addiction. So about half of people who have serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, about half of those people will develop an alcohol problem at some time in their life. And so this study was basically saying, hey, let's recruit about 80 of those people, and let's look to see if trying this using ETG and giving incentives for alcohol negative ETG samples, if we added that onto just ongoing treatment as usual in a community mental health center, what were the outcomes? And so everyone in this study is receiving treatment as usual for their addiction and for their serious mental illness. And we're doing ETG testing 3 times a week in this study. And we're looking at what you're seeing in front of you is the percentage of people who are alcohol abstinent as assessed by ETG. The bottom line is the control group. This is, we call it non-contingent because we're giving people prizes. They get to draw for prizes even if their samples are positive. So that's our control group. So they still get prizes, but they don't have to be abstinent from alcohol. And then the blue line is our contingency management group, where they submit urine tests for alcohol and they only get prizes if they're abstinent. And so what you can see is there's a big difference. It's about 3 times less alcohol use in the contingency management group versus the control group. And what you'll see is on average about 80% of people in the contingency management group are abstinent any given week from alcohol, and as compared to about 40 to 50% in the non-contingent group. So the end of the story about can contingency management work for alcohol is really, yeah, it does seem like it can. So next slide, please. So then that led us to think, would this be a tool that might be helpful to Native communities? Would contingency management, specifically targeting alcohol, be something that would be effective? And so within about a period of about a year, I was approached by Deidre Buchwald, who's the leader of NCARE and iReach and has done work in Native communities, partnering with Native communities for many years. And she said, you know, we're doing a lot of work on heart disease, we're doing work on diabetes, cancer, but our partners are saying they really want to do something focused on alcohol and drugs. And so we, at that point, then did a bunch of community meetings, responded to a couple of grant applications, and we're fortunate enough, because of our amazing partners, really, and Deidre's great mentorship, we were fortunate enough to have 2 studies funded on contingency management as a treatment for alcohol use. And the first one I'm going to talk about is also targets drugs, because as a lot of you know, in addiction treatment, and even more common in Native communities, you don't usually treat one addiction. We're usually treating a number of substances at once. And so, these are some pictures of me in this wonderful opportunity to get to go out and visit communities and spend time there and learn from our partners and really see the resilience and the amazing work that Native communities are doing to combat problems with alcohol. So next slide, please. So these are stats that most of you know. You know, the first stat that I always lead with is Native people are more likely than any other racial group, if again, this is grouping Native people as a whole, which I know is not what we want to do. We want to talk about communities as individual communities, and I've learned the value of that. But when we put groups together, Native people have the highest rates of abstinence from alcohol and drugs compared to any other ethnic or racial group. That's important to know. But at the same time, Native communities also, again, on average, some Native communities don't struggle with alcohol use problems, but many do. People are more likely to have an alcohol use problem. Native people are also more likely in general to seek out treatment, but they're more likely to drop out. And so really, communities need accessible, feasible, culturally appropriate, and maybe and a lot of us who are researchers are coming with options for evidence-based interventions, and knowing whether or not these are culturally acceptable, practically acceptable, and effective is really important, and to move the field forward so that policymakers can make decisions, and tribal leaders and communities can make independent decisions about how they want to deal and combat alcohol problems in their communities. Next slide, please. So the first study I'm going to talk about is the Rewarding Recovery Study. And this is a partnership between WSU and a rural Northern Plains American Indian community that's on a reservation-based community. And we have our goal, the first goal is listed, the scientific goal is listed first from our NIH grant, but I like Albert Foote, who's pictured here in front of a teepee at a powwow where we're recruiting for the study. I like his explanation, which is he's a wise man and good with words, and his description is really, after doing the study, his goal is to provide participants with a sense of accomplishment in a non-judgmental atmosphere, and to help them create a routine in which they feel they have a sense of purpose. And so I really like that, and because that resonates with me, and I think it resonates with participants, and is in his words, which are much better than my NIH grant words. So next slide, please. So, but I'm going to go back to my NIH grant words. So our specific aims for both of these two studies I'm going to talk about were first to see if we could we did some focus groups to maximize the cultural acceptability of the intervention, sort of to figure out what would we do different if we're going to do this in a Native community, how should we do it different? And then when we conducted our randomized controlled trial, we wanted to see if people were more likely, of course, less likely to use alcohol or drugs compared to a control group. And we wanted to also look at other outcomes that are important. It's not just important that people stop using alcohol or drugs, it's important that their lives improve. And so we wanted to look at some other things as well. And then we also want to identify, it's not enough also to just know if an intervention works or not. We really want to know who it works for and why. And not just looking at, people's ages, but also looking at their cultural background, where they come from, how they were raised, have they experienced historical trauma, looking at those kind of factors. And in both studies, we're going to be doing those analyses. So next slide, please. So this study is unique for 3 different reasons. One, it's the first intervention or study of investigating contingency management in a Native community. 2, it's, I think, the first one that's investigating contingency management as intervention in a rural community. So you can think about if you're required to come in 2 times a week, that might mean something very different in downtown Seattle or in an urban place than it does in a large reservation. And so that's, I think, an important contribution. This is also, I think, one of the first studies to look at in a randomized controlled trial, to look at whether or not to answer an important clinical question, which is, I often think to myself, and people often ask me, if somebody comes in and they have a problem with cocaine and alcohol, which one should I target? What's the right one to target? And we have these long discussions clinically about that, and we try to think about that. So in this study, we wanted to answer that question. So in this study, people come in, we screen them for their eligibility. They have to be adults. They have to self-report they're Native. Then we do a baseline interview with them where we ask them a bunch of questions. Then they're randomized to 4 conditions. One is they get contingency management, they get incentives for being abstinent from alcohol, but they can continue to have positive tests for drugs. They'll still get rewarded. The next group is contingency management, but for drugs. So they, together with the team, with the clinician, they pick a drug of choice, and we reward their abstinence from that, but they can still be using alcohol. And then the next group is the highest bar. So for the contingency management for alcohol and drugs, those individuals have to be abstinent from both alcohol and drugs to get a reward. And then the last group is what we call the control group, is, again, non-contingent control group, where they come in just for showing up and giving a urine sample. They get to draw for prizes. And so those are the 4 groups in the study, and they come in 3 times. They came in 3 times a week for 12 weeks. And then after those 12 weeks, we then ask them to come back 1, 3, and 6 months to see if the effects of the intervention last over time. So as I mentioned, we completed this study last fall. We're working on analyzing the data and planning for community dissemination now. So I'm going to be able to share a few results with you, but we really want to make sure that we have disseminated the results to the community before we share them more widely. So the results I'm going to share with you are going to be very general. Next slide, please. So before I move on, one clear point of clarity. In all these studies, people are eligible and we encourage them to receive whatever other alcohol and drug treatments are available in their community. Whether or not they choose to receive them is up to them, but we encourage them and try to partner with the other addiction treatment providers and to get them other interventions as well. So first we did some focus groups and interviews with consumers, family members, and community members. And the participants' feedback were that they really wanted recovery promoting family-oriented and culturally specific rewards. So things like inspirational books. So if those of you know The Red Road to Recovery, that was mentioned as an example in terms of sort of wanting books by that fit with that sort of well-variety perspective that would help facilitate their recovery. Participants' gifts for children. So, you know, a lot of folks have kids and they really talked about not being able to provide for their children in part because of their addiction. And as they were not using, they really wanted to be able to have gifts that they could give to their children. So the gifts would be, they would receive the rewards from us, but they wouldn't be able to give them to their children. And then other things were mentioned that are sort of more culturally based, like artwork, native art, ceramics, beadwork, sage, breastplates, drums, big things like eagle feathers, big things that really fit with honoring someone and an important accomplishment. And then things like cedar bands. Next, please. So here are two examples of quotes. If you could see like if the reward was a little different, you know, if at the end of the process, someone getting a drum or something, that would be totally amazing. Beadwork, you know, things that were made by people that they know and care about. So you could see that sort of collectivist, kind of family-oriented, sort of community-oriented. It would be even better if we could get something from an artist or artisan in our community. The other piece is giving something special to recognize an accomplishment. And so in our study, people were given cedar sort of at the end as sort of a way of honoring them for participating in the study, in addition even to the rewards they received for abstinence. We wanted to honor people for just participating and giving back to the community. And then the other one, coming back to the Christmas idea, that's something for our kids that we can afford at Christmas time, or something, you know, we can build things up like that for them. So wanting to really build their children up was another piece of feedback we received. So next slide. So the results are actually pretty interesting, and they're very initial, and I'm going to talk about them very general because we have to, you know, go back in and dive in and analyze the data in more depth. But what we're finding overall is the answer to getting people to use less drugs who have alcohol and a drug problem is reinforcing their drug abstinence, which I was kind of surprised by. But that's at least what our initial analyses are showing us, is that the biggest bang for our buck is if we target illicit drug use in a sample of people who are alcohol dependent who also use drugs. And adding that additional incentive or requirement to be abstinent from alcohol isn't really adding much in terms of the effectiveness. And so we'll be analyzing these more in detail and sort of confirming that these results hold as we go over time, but that's sort of the initial impression we're getting from our data. So our next steps in this study are to really focus on community dissemination and larger dissemination. So I'm going to talk about the HONOR study, which is a similar study where we're recruiting people who are alcohol dependent, and we're just targeting alcohol abstinence as assessed by that ETG. So we're not targeting other drugs. We're measuring if people change their other drug use, but we're not targeting it. And this study is a little different in that it involves 3 communities: one urban Alaska Native community, a reservation-based community in the Northern Plains, and then an urban in the Northwest and another urban Indian clinic in terms of our recruitment. And so the idea is that this is a multi-site trial. It's just targeting alcohol. Those are kind of the main differences. Again, people have to self-report that they're Native and have to be adults and be struggling primarily with alcohol to be in the study. So next slide. And our aims are the same. First, we wanted to look at how would we change this intervention, and we really wanted to look at that across these 3 very different communities in terms of their values, in terms of the things that are available in their community as rewards. What do people want? How do they want this to be different? How are they going to implement it? For instance, in one of our sites, we have a research team that's a division of a large Native healthcare organization that's implementing the study and the intervention. In our other sites, we have clinicians clinicians who are not researchers by training, who have been trained to become researchers, and they're doing the intervention. So we wanted to sort of show that we could do this intervention and it would work amongst these different groups, across different communities with different values and different sort of healthcare systems. So, but our goals are the same. We want to see if this contingency management helps people reduce their drinking and other outcomes related to that, and we really want to look at predictors in this group. So next slide. So the design is a little different here. Partially, I'm going to give you a real quick, we're running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to go relatively quickly, but one thing we've really found is helpful in our studies in of any contingency management intervention is to use what we call an induction phase, or what we call practically the warm-up. And so in the induction phase, what happens is a person comes in and they get rewarded just for showing up. So they just get the control condition or the non-contingent intervention, but so for 4 weeks, they just get rewarded for showing up. And what that allows us to do is it allows people to learn about the intervention and to get rewarded and see what the rewards are like. Because what we have happen in contingency management interventions, especially at the beginning, is when you tell a person they're in contingency management, they give a urine sample and it's positive, and they don't get any prizes, or maybe they get one of those $1 prizes. Oftentimes they're like, see you later. And we have a very high attrition rate. And so what we're doing in this study, and we're doing in a lot of my other studies now, is we're using this warm-up phase. And we're asking people to come in twice a week for 4 weeks, and they get rewarded just for showing up. And then we're only randomizing people who show up at least half the time, and who also show that they still need treatment by having one positive ETG test. And so I'll talk a little bit about why that's important. What we've shown and others have shown in studies of contingency management is that really helps reduce your attrition rate once you've randomized someone. So in this study, people are coming in for a baseline appointment. They're then participating in this warm-up phase. And then those who are still participating at the end of that warm-up or induction phase are being randomized to treatment as usual and contingency management, or treatment as usual and continuing to get prizes just for showing up for 12 weeks. And then we have a 3-month follow-up in this study. So next slide, please. Thank you. So our goal is to recruit 400 people. We're nearly there. We're very, very close. 400 people across the 3 sites total. What we thought was that when we started the study, we really thought that about 300 or so of those 400 would make it on and be randomized. But what we found is only about 140. I don't know the exact numbers, but around less than 150 have actually been randomized. And so a lot of our work now is figuring out why that's the case. And most of it is related to just not showing up frequently enough. And so that's an issue that we're going to be thinking about and talking about a lot in the next year. So we're almost done with the study. We're going to be done with data collection this summer and hopefully be moving towards disseminating to the communities and then publications next fall. The other thing that I always like to talk about is this study is also through NIAAA, through the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, has funded the dissertation work of Catherine Herchak, who is Eastern Shoshone and is now at University of New Mexico. So that's been a wonderful thing, is to see us help us train a Native investigator and get them through their PhD program. And her wonderful support of our study has been fantastic as well. Our next steps, again, are to complete data collection and publication, as I mentioned, will be happening in 2019. So next slide. So we don't, again, it's sort of a cliffhanger. We don't have the official results to share with you all, but some of the practical lessons we've learned, and I know if my partners were here, they would share even more of these because this knowledge comes from them, which is that, each Native community, and a lot of you know this because you're doing this work and you've been doing this work for a while and you've been living this life, but people face multiple challenges and strengths. Alcohol problems are not the only problem that people in our studies are facing. They're facing so many more problems, whether it's social determinants of health and the impact that has on their life, whether it's diabetes or other things. They're facing many challenges, and sort of where alcohol addiction and where alcohol treatment lies in terms of their priorities or their needs at that moment is different for each person. And then they also have different strengths, amazing strengths. And through these studies, especially that last study, the honors study, we're really trying to gather as much information as we can about people's strengths. And to really identify who are the people whose resilience and strengths help them recover from alcohol problems. And I also have learned that it's not just about individuals, it's about communities. Communities are all different, and they all have different challenges, and they all have different amazing strengths. And my job as a researcher and as an expert in contingency management is just to get out of the way and let our communities, and this was really tough for me as a non-native researcher with no experience working in native communities at the beginning, was that I wanted people to follow my evidence-based treatment protocols. I wanted them to collect the data the way I wanted it to. And it took me a few years to learn that that was a discussion. And it was a discussion depending on their willingness and their expertise in terms of, they knew their community the best. They knew how to recruit people the best. They knew how to implement the intervention the best. They knew who to do it, and they knew how to do it. And so what it really was is a learning process. And I hope that more researchers and more clinical experts from non-native communities are able to understand that, because that's been a really important experience. And I think that's what makes our research really powerful as we go forward and disseminate, is that we really let each community own the intervention. They still had to adhere to the number of prizes that were given out and the frequency that they were giving out. They had to do the urine test the way we asked them to. But really, outside of that, each community could make the intervention their own. The other things, of course, there's some practical things. Treatment as usual is not something everybody uses, and whether or not that will impact their outcomes, I think, is something we're going to be able to study. It'll be interesting. Transportation is a huge issue, especially rural communities, but in any community, and that relates to these 2 times a week. Maybe that's just too much. It's not feasible for people. And then the last thing, which I think is a unique advantage in native communities, especially communities that can blend funding from other sources with their healthcare funding, is that really we have an opportunity to figure out how we pay for contingency management. Because in the non-native world, the way it's very hard to get people to pay for it, because it's not a talk therapy, it's not a billable medication or something you can prescribe. So the VA, the Veterans Administration, is the only system that, to my knowledge, has really taken this on as an intervention. So next slide. All right, so here are just a couple 3 articles that we've published about our 2 studies. 2 are describing the methods of the studies that the honor study and the rewarding recovery study, and 1 is focused on that Dr. Hershak led, is focused on some of our feasibility and cultural acceptability data from the honor study. So those are available online, and if you can't get them online, please feel free to contact me and we'll be sure to get them to you. So thank you everyone for your time. I'm looking forward to answering questions as time allows, and I appreciate your time and attention. Oh, and sorry, I should make sure I thank everybody. I'm usually good at this, so I just want to we want to thank for sure the NIH, and that includes the NIAAA and MHD, who funded, along with the Office of the Director, which the acronym for that part's OBSSR. And of course, our wonderful communities who I've learned so much from, and some of our staff here that have worked and either gone on to graduate school or to get new jobs, or Abe Lyons, who now is leading our efforts for the honor study, our wonderful CAB and DSMB. And really, the thing that strikes me every time I do a study in native communities is how dedicated the participants are to helping their communities, and how they really understand that this is one way, or they really feel like this is one way that they can make their communities better and help people.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mike. This is Gladys. So I have one question here in the Q&A for you. An attendee is asking, it seems this approach is designed for outpatient therapy where a person is mostly living on their own. Oh, yeah. Is there any efficacy in applying this in a residential or inpatient setting where access to substances is already reduced or eliminated?
That's a great question. So the short answer is yes, although I get where the person's going with the second point, which is that it's really hard to get access to drugs and alcohol when you're, hopefully, when you're in an inpatient facility. So I would really encourage the people to think about maybe other targets that you could reward in terms of participation in groups, or other treatment targets that we know are related to substance use, and maybe reinforcing those. The other one, big one that just jumps out at me always in inpatient settings is getting people to stop smoking. That's always in it. Most people are allowed to smoke, or maybe that there's a smoking area, so incentivizing that. That's one. But the thing I'm really interested in, and I think is really relevant, and I'd be interested to hear other people's feedback on this, is what happens to people when they leave that residential facility. So you're in Wyoming, for instance, and you're sent off to an inpatient facility that's maybe in California, or maybe it's in North Dakota, who knows? And how could we work with those? How could we work with those inpatient settings so that we could reinforce people right away when they're coming back to their community, so that they had some follow-up that was related to and where we had objective assessment. So how can we partner as community providers or Native communities or any community with these treatment providers so that we could close that gap, that people wouldn't fall through the cracks when they come back? And I think that the incentives might play a particularly powerful place in there. So other non-alcohol and drug treatment targets, though, that are related to outcomes in terms of the inpatient setting. And then afterwards, I really think it would be great if we could do more work to incentivize people to stay sober, stay abstinent after they're coming out of inpatient.
Excellent. I have 3 more questions that quickly popped up. So a question from Victoria, who is asking, does stages of change, for example, pre-contemplation, contemplation, etc., matter for the subjects? Or were you able to gauge that during the induction process?
That's another excellent question. So what we know in terms of general contingency management research is that motivation to change does not seem to be correlated with outcomes in contingency management. But the question about the induction or that warm-up phase, I think, is a really interesting one. So we are gathering data we have measures of motivation to change, and we'll be looking at that. So that's a really great, you're doing my job for me. That's a really great analysis that we should definitely be doing.
Perfect. So another attendee is asking, I know one of the limitations of contingency management is that once rewards are no longer given, relapse can occur. Any tips for avoiding this if using CM?
That's a great point. So I would first say that if a person is insulin dependent and you take away their insulin, they're probably going to have problems. So I have sort of a fundamental problem with that. If we have this sort of high standard for behavioral treatments, which I think some of us who developed them have set up for ourselves, but medications don't have that same high standard outside of immunizations, right? You don't say to someone, this is my, take this part medicine and then stop in most time, right? So I think that's one just sort of philosophical issue that I always challenge people on to think about. At the same time, I know it's not always feasible. So what we do know in contingency management is that in all of our studies in co-occurring disorders, in particular, people with serious mental illness and addiction, we always find a significant difference in self-reported alcohol and drug use in the follow-up phase, in the 3 or 4 months after the person stops getting the prizes. And there's been one study that's shown, at least one, there's been a few studies that have shown that abstinence rates in contingency management are comparable to an evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapy for up to a year. So I think there's things that we're doing, and I have a couple of grants that I've submitted recently that are really, and other people are doing this work too, that are really focused on a more feasible sort of maintenance phase for contingency management. Maybe you get the rewards less often. Maybe you go into a non-treatment setting. Maybe you go to the pharmacy and you get a blood test for alcohol, for instance, and you might get an incentive there. So, there's other ways that we could sort of extend contingency management to make it more feasible and cost-effective. But that you're raising one of the number one critiques of contingency management. And those are usually the 2 ways that I respond is we could certainly be doing a better job to do that. But I also think if we think about addiction as a relapsing chronic disease, then maybe we should think about contingency management models that are long-term for people.
Perfect. So thanks, Mike. You have a lot of questions generating here. We might have to follow up via email on some of these, but the next question is Steve, who is asking, were the urine analysis or urine samples observed? Also, did you only test on site? From a contingency management standpoint, how did your providers handle the urine, the UAs that were adulterated or did not temp?
Yeah, so those are clearly, he has a lot of experience doing urine tests. So we do not observe them because, again, we're like, if someone's going to try to trick us over a prize, we're not going to do anything about it. We're really trying to build a culture sort of trust with folks. And so we don't observe UAs we do, walk down to the bathroom with people. We aren't, trying to be naive, but so we don't observe UAs. We do just the temperature assessment. And when the temperature is off, we just say to the person, the temperature is off, either give a new sample or we're going to consider it positive. And we're real upfront about that from the start, because that's the biggest issue we have is people pouring water in. We typically find that just people don't want to try to trick us for a $20 prize. It's not something people do. I'm sorry, and I know there was another part to that question. Oh, we do them all on site. Yes, that's important. I didn't emphasize that at the beginning. The more, when a person engages in a behavior, it's important to reinforce them immediately. And so we want to be able to do those urine tests on site for sure.
Great. So the next question is from Marie, and she is asking, is there any kinds of reduced behaviors in the groups that checking for alcohol and drugs? Are people foregoing both of the substances regardless of where they are randomized?
That's a great question. So I can't tell you in that study because we have not done that complex of analysis. But I can tell you from my work in non-native communities, what we are finding repeatedly is that if we reinforce cocaine abstinence, alcohol drug use goes down, or alcohol use goes down. In our last study, that study that I showed you the figure on with the two lines, the graph there, what we found in that study was we found a significant reduction in crack cocaine use in that group. Amongst the smaller group of people who use cocaine and alcohol. And so what we find is that, yes, when we target one, the other one goes down. Other drugs go down, including smoking, which I think is sort of counter to a lot of our clinical experience and sort of clinical lore, which is if you get people to stop using alcohol, they're probably going to smoke more. If you get people to stop using meth, probably going to smoke more. We find the opposite.
Okay, thank you. I have a question here as well from Sean, who asks, when it comes to ethnicity, I know there are some speculation when it comes to how people metabolize alcohol, and studies of differences have not always been validated. But when compared to Aboriginal peoples from around the world, they see there is a difference in metabolism of alcohol. So how is alcohol, apologize, I'm going to brutalize this.
Yeah, I've got it, Gladys. I've read it.
Okay, okay.
So that's a really great question that I don't think I'm qualified to answer, which is I've had researchers bring that same topic up to me. And what we find is that we're not, I think the answer I would get to that is that we don't see any, in the ETG tests that I've done, and I guess we should do a paper on this, or analyze it, because we have 20,000 solar samples from non-native populations and 20 from native populations. And of course, all native, as you're mentioning, all native people are different. And so I think that what my short answer is, we're not differentiating at such a fine line that would matter. So while there might be average differences on average in terms of the ethyl glucuronide produced by a person because they're native, where it's such a small level that I don't think that that difference is so large that we would see more positive urine tests in native people than we would see in other populations. But I have heard some other people bring up that point, and I think that's something we could definitely look at.
I have two really quick questions, and then we need to wrap up. One of them from Candace is, does this also work with youth, or has it only been tried on adults?
So definitely this is an approach, and that's in fact Dr. Hershak, her diversity supplement, her dissertation was focused on using it with young adults. And whenever I go to native communities, I should say all native communities, but every community I talked about at work says, why aren't we doing this with youth? So what the most research that's been done on contingency management is focused on cannabis and marijuana. And so there has been a number of studies that have shown this is an effective approach for youth. And developmentally, I don't see any reason why this wouldn't even be more effective for youth, because it would be definitely something that I would be excited to see tried.
Last question, thank you, Mike, is from Kenneth. Are you controlling for ACE scores?
So by that, I'm assuming you mean early childhood experiences and trauma. Yes, so we have, not only are we controlling for early childhood trauma, we're also, well, when we say controlling, we're gathering data about early childhood trauma, ongoing current trauma, and historical trauma and loss. And so we have all those data. certainly in the honors study, I think also in the rewarding recovery study, and we'll be analyzing those, but we don't know how those are impacting outcomes. It's an important part of our study, though.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much, Mike, and to all the attendees today. If there are any outstanding questions, Dr. McDonell did suggest that he was available to connect with people. This webinar will be posted with the presentation on our website afterwards, and we'll send the link along with the survey out to all participants within the next day. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.